The air in the restaurant always felt different as the evening began. It was a quiet hum that started low and then grew, a mix of soft chatter, the clinking of ice in glasses, and the gentle classical music that floated from the corner of the room. This was the Aurelia, a place where people came to be seen, to make deals, or to celebrate special moments with price tags that made most people gasp. And in the middle of it all was her. She was a young woman, 24, with a way of moving that made her seem like part of the background. Her dark hair was always pulled back tightly into a bun, not a single strand out of place. Her uniform, a simple black dress with a white apron, was always crisp and clean. She was a waitress, but she was more like a ghost. She floated between the tables, her feet barely making a sound on the thick, patterned carpet. She would appear at a table just as someone was thinking, "I could use another glass of water," and the water would appear. She would clear away empty plates with such quiet grace that the people having the conversation would sometimes not even notice she had been there, that her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Would you care for some pepper?" she would ask, and the diners would often just nod, their eyes fixed on the more important people at their table. She was used to it. She had learned early on that in a world of loud personalities and big wallets, being quiet and invisible was a skill. It kept her job safe and made her a good employee. But it was a lonely way to live. Every night, as she went about her work, her eyes would find their way to the same spot. Tucked away on a small raised platform in the corner, like a king on his throne, sat a grand black piano. It was a beautiful, shiny thing with a smooth, polished surface that reflected the candlelight from the dining room. It looked powerful, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for the right person to come along and wake it up. To her, it wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a wooden box full of stories, a silent friend that understood all the things she couldn't say out loud. Around 7 o'clock, the restaurant's pianist would arrive. He was an older man with a serious face and stiff shoulders. He would walk to the piano, sit down on the bench, and with a sigh, he would begin to play. His music was perfect. Every note was exactly where it was supposed to be. The rhythm was flawless, the technique was impressive, but it was empty. It was like looking at a beautiful painting of a person, but the painting had no eyes. There was no feeling, no life, no story behind the notes. He played because it was his job, and you could hear it in every single perfect, boring chord. The young woman would listen as she refilled water glasses and wiped down tables. She knew the pieces he played. She had heard them many times before. But as she listened, she would hear them differently in her head. She would imagine how they would sound if they were played with a little more sadness or a little more joy. She would close her eyes for just a second and picture her own fingers on those ivory keys, pressing down and letting a different kind of music fill the room. A music that had a heart. Sometimes when she was clearing a table, her fingers would move on their own. As she picked up a plate, her thumb and index finger would press together as if playing a silent chord. She would hum a soft melody under her breath, a tune that was hers and hers alone. It was a secret she kept locked away tight, a world that belonged only to her. In that world, she wasn't a quiet waitress in the background. She was the one everyone was listening to. She was the one making them feel something. She watched the people in the restaurant. A rich man in a fancy suit laughed loudly, telling a story that made everyone at his table nod and smile, even if it wasn't that funny. A young couple on a first date sat in awkward silence, both looking at their phones more than at each other. A family was celebrating a birthday, their voices full of excitement and happiness. She saw all these little moments, all these different lives playing out in front of her. She felt like she was watching a movie, but she was never in the scene. She was just the person in the dark holding the popcorn. She would sometimes wonder what they would think if they knew. What if the man in the fancy suit knew that the quiet girl who just poured his wine could write a song that could make him cry? What if the young couple on their date knew that she could play a melody that would break the silence between them and make them talk for hours? But they didn't know, and she would never tell them. Her secret was safe, locked away with the silent, powerful piano in the corner of the room. The night would go on. The pianist would play his perfect, empty music. The people would eat their expensive food and drink their expensive wine, and she would continue her quiet dance through the tables, a ghost in a world of the living. But every time she passed the piano, she would look at it, and in her mind, she would promise it that one day, maybe, just maybe, she would be the one to set it free. She would be the one to give it a voice. For now, though, there were plates to be cleared and glasses to be filled. The wait would have to continue. The rain started just as the first guests were arriving. It wasn't a gentle, cleansing rain, but a cold, persistent drizzle that made the city outside look gray and blurry. Inside the Aurelia, the warm lights and soft music usually fought back the gloom, but tonight something was missing. The usual pre-dinner melody, the gentle soundtrack that made people feel comfortable and important, was absent. The young waitress noticed it the moment she walked onto the floor. The corner where the grand piano usually sat, holding court, was empty and dark. The bench was pushed in neatly, as if waiting for someone who was never going to arrive. She felt a small, strange flutter in her stomach, a mix of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite name. Her question was answered a few minutes later when she saw the manager. Mr. Dubois hurried past her. His face, usually a calm mask of professional control, was tight with worry. He was on the phone, his voice a low, urgent whisper that she could still catch snippets of. "No, I understand. A fever, you say?" "Yes, of course, rest. But tonight?" He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time she had ever seen. He ended the call with a frustrated sigh, and snapped his phone shut. The pianist was sick. This fact hung in the air like a bad smell. The manager began to pace, his steps quick and sharp on the thick carpet. He would walk to the kitchen door, say a few harsh words to someone inside, then walk back to the front of the restaurant, his eyes scanning the room as if he was looking for a lost child. The special feeling of the Aurelia, the thing that made it worth the high prices, was broken. Without the music, the restaurant was just a room with tables and chairs. As more diners arrived, the problem became worse. The clatter of silverware against plates was a loud, ugly sound without music to soften it. People's conversations seemed to echo, sounding harsh and public instead of soft and private. A woman at a table near the window looked over at the silent piano and frowned, then said something to her husband that made him shake his head. The manager saw it, and his shoulders slumped a little more. He was losing the battle before it had even begun. The young waitress watched it all unfold as she went about her work. She poured water and took orders, but her mind was not fully on her tasks. It was in that empty corner. She saw the manager make another phone call, then another, his voice growing more desperate each time. He was calling other musicians, other pianists, but it was a rainy Tuesday night. No one was available on such short notice. The silence in the restaurant grew heavier, filling up all the spaces where the music should have been. She felt a strange pull towards the piano. It was like seeing a friend who was sad and wanting to do something to make them feel better. The black, shiny wood seemed to call to her. A small, crazy spark of an idea began to flicker in the back of her mind. What if? The thought was so shocking that she quickly pushed it away. Don't be silly, she told herself. You're a waitress. Your job is to be invisible, not to be seen. But the idea didn't go away. It just hid, waiting. The evening wore on, and the manager's panic turned into a quiet desperation. He tried to solve the problem in other ways. He told the kitchen to turn down the lights a little more, to make the room feel seer. He asked the servers to be extra quiet, to move with even more grace than usual. But it was no use. The silence was the loudest thing in the room. People were eating their expensive food, but they weren't enjoying it in the same way. The magic was gone. The young waitress felt a knot of sympathy tighten in her chest for the manager. He took so much pride in this place, and tonight it was failing him. She saw him standing by the Mater D's stand, just staring into the room with a look of defeat on his face. He looked smaller, older. He was a man who had lost control of his world, and that's when the flicker of an idea in her mind grew into a tiny flame. She looked at the empty piano bench. She looked at the sad face of her boss. She looked at the restless, unhappy diners. The music was inside her, a river of notes and melodies that she had kept dammed up for years. What was the point of having all that music if it could never be heard? What good was it doing, locked away in her head? Fear was a cold hand on her shoulder. It whispered to her, reminding her of all the reasons why she shouldn't. They will laugh at you. You are not good enough. You will be fired. You will make a fool of yourself in front of all these important people. The fear was strong, and it felt very real. She could feel her heart start to beat faster, a frantic drum against her ribs. Her palms felt sweaty, but another voice, a quieter but stronger one, spoke up. It was the voice of the music itself. It told her that this was not about being the best. It was about filling the silence. It was about helping. It was about setting the music free just for a little while. The voice asked her a simple question. What is more frightening? Playing a song and maybe making a mistake, or letting this beautiful place die of silence tonight? She took a deep breath and tried to calm her racing heart. She was clearing a table near the back of the room, her hands moving automatically, folding napkins and stacking plates. But her eyes were fixed on the manager, who was now having a quiet, angry argument with the maître d'. She saw the moment he gave up. He threw his hands in the air in a gesture of surrender and turned to face the small group of servers who were waiting for their next tables. Okay, that's it, he said, his voice loud and tired. Does anyone here play anything? A guitar? An accordion? Anything at all? He said it with a short, bitter laugh, as if he already knew the answer was no. The other servers just shook their heads or looked at the floor. They were all as uncomfortable as the diners. The world seemed to slow down for the young woman. The voices of the people in the restaurant faded into a dull roar. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart and the quiet voice of the music in her head. This was her chance. It might be the only chance she would ever get. It was terrifying, and it was exhilarating. Her hand, which had been holding a dirty plate, began to rise. It felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She saw the manager's eyes sweep past her, full of disappointment. He was about to turn away, to accept his defeat. And in that split second, she made her choice. Her hand went up, just a little bit at first, then higher. It was a small, shaky gesture in the middle of a large, elegant room. At first, no one noticed. But then the manager's eyes came back to her. He stared, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He looked at her uniform, at her quiet face, and then back at her raised hand. You? He asked, his voice full of doubt. You play the piano? She couldn't speak. She just nodded, her throat too tight to form words. The other servers turned to look at her, their faces a mask of shock. The quiet, invisible waitress had just stepped into the light. The manager stared at her for a long, tense moment. He was desperate. She was his only and most unlikely option. He let out a long, slow breath, the air whistling through his teeth. Fine, he said, his voice flat. Go on, one song. Just to fill the gap. Don't make a scene. She put the plate down on a nearby table with a soft clatter. Her legs felt weak as she began to walk towards the corner. Every step felt like a mile. The eyes of the entire staff were on her, and she could feel the curious glances of some of the diners as well. She was no longer a ghost. She was a person walking with a purpose that no one in the room understood. She reached the small stage, climbed the 3 steps, and walked over to the piano. She sat down on the smooth wooden bench. It felt cool and firm beneath her. She placed her trembling fingers on the ivory keys, the familiar touch sending a jolt of both fear and electricity through her body. The whole room was waiting. The world seemed to shrink to the small wooden bench beneath her. The cool, smooth ivory of the keys felt both familiar and terrifying under her trembling fingers. The restaurant, which had been her entire world for so long, faded into a blur of soft lights and dark shapes. The low murmur of conversations, the clinking of glasses, it all sounded like it was happening very far away, underwater. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the walls of her chest, desperate to escape. The manager's words echoed in her mind. One song? Just to fill the gap? Don't make a scene. The pressure was immense. She was not a musician. She was a waitress playing a part. What if she was terrible? What if her hands, which knew the feel of a heavy tray so well, betrayed her now? She took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. She looked down at her hands, resting on the keys. They looked small and pale. They didn't look like the hands of a pianist. They looked like the hands of someone who cleared tables and scrubbed counters late at night. A wave of doubt washed over her, cold and sharp. This was a mistake. She should stand up, apologize, and go back to her tables, back to being invisible. It was safer there. It was where she belonged, but then she closed her eyes. And in the darkness behind her eyelids, she could see it. She could see the music. Not as notes on a page, but as colors and shapes and feelings. It was a story she had been writing in her head for years, a song born from long nights and quiet observations. It was the feeling of being lonely in a crowded room. It was the secret joy of a perfect sunset seen from a bus window. It was the ache of a dream you're afraid to speak out loud. This music was the truest part of her, the part she had kept hidden from everyone. And the silent piano in front of her was waiting for it. With another breath, this one a little steadier, she decided. She would not play the songs the old pianist played. She would not try to be perfect or technical. She would just play her song. She would set her own story free, just this once. Her fingers, still shaking, found the starting position. It was a simple chord, but it felt like the hardest thing she had ever done. She pressed down. The first note was a little hesitant, a soft question that hung in the air. It was not loud or showy. It was almost a whisper. A few people at the nearest tables glanced over, their expressions curious but not yet captivated. They saw a waitress at the piano, a strange little interruption to their evening. But then the second note followed, and a third. Slowly a melody began to form. It was a simple, sad little tune, like a child singing a lullaby to a doll. It was not perfect. There was a slight wobble in her touch, a human imperfection that made it sound real. As the melody continued, something began to change. The fear that had been holding her captive started to loosen its grip. Her fingers, which had been stiff and unsure, began to relax. They remembered the way, the path they had traveled so many times in her imagination. The music started to flow more easily, like a stream that had found its way past a dam. She was no longer thinking about the people watching or the manager's worried face. She was no longer a waitress in a fancy restaurant. She was just a girl and her piano telling a story. The melody began to grow, becoming more complex and confident. It was no longer just a sad little tune. It was a conversation. One part of the song would ask a lonely question, and another part would answer with a hopeful phrase. It was the story of the young couple on their awkward first date, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. It was the story of the rich man in the fancy suit whose loud laugh didn't quite reach his eyes. She poured all of her observations, all of her secret feelings into the music. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was her voice, and the room began to listen. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, spreading wave of silence. A man putting a forkful of food into his mouth stopped, his hand frozen in mid-air. He turned his head towards the corner of the room. The young couple, who had been staring at their phones, slowly put them down on the table, their screens going dark. They looked at each other and then towards the music, their expressions softening. The low murmur of conversations began to die out, one by one, like candles being snuffed. The clinking of glasses and the scraping of forks faded away. Replaced by the clear, expressive sound of the piano, the young woman, her eyes still closed, could feel the change. She could feel the energy of the room shift from restless and noisy to still and focused. It was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the empty, awkward silence from before. It was a full, heavy silence, a listening silence. The air was thick with attention. Every person in the room was held captive by the music, by the story she was telling. They didn't see a waitress anymore. They saw a musician, a storyteller, a soul laid bare, the song built to its peak, a cascade of powerful, emotional chords that filled every corner of the restaurant. It was a sound that was both beautiful and heartbreaking, full of a longing that everyone in the room, in their own way, could understand. It was the sound of a dream finally being spoken aloud, a wish being made upon a star. It was the sound of the invisible girl finally being seen, not with the eyes, but with the heart. She played with a passion she didn't know she possessed, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. Completely lost in the world she was creating with her own two hands. Then, as gently as it had begun, the music started to quiet down. The powerful chords softened, the fast melody slowed, and the song began to resolve. It was like a long, deep breath being let out. She played a final, soft chord, a single note that echoed the quiet question from the beginning of the song. And then she lifted her fingers from the keys. The final note hung in the air, shimmering and beautiful, before it slowly faded into nothing. And in its place, a silence fell that was more profound than any the restaurant had ever known. It was a sacred, breathless silence. No one moved. No one spoke. They just sat there, stunned, held in the spell of the moment. The young woman opened her eyes, her chest heaving, her fingers still resting on the keys. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. She looked out at the room, at the sea of faces turned towards her, and saw something she had never seen before in the Aurelia. She saw a room full of people who had forgotten about their expensive food and their important business deals. They had forgotten about everything. They had only been listening. The silence that followed the last note was not empty. It was full. It was a heavy, thick blanket that settled over the entire restaurant, wrapping every single person in a shared moment of wonder. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the young woman at the piano had poured a liquid feeling into the air, and now everyone was breathing it in. The last soft vibration of the string inside the grand piano had faded, but the music was still there, hanging in the space between the tables, echoing in the hearts of everyone who had heard it. A man in an expensive suit, who had been in the middle of telling a very important story, now sat with his mouth slightly open, his words forgotten. His hand, which had been gesturing in the air, was frozen. He was not a businessman anymore. He was just a man who had been reminded of something beautiful and long forgotten. The young couple on their first date were no longer looking at their phones. They were looking at each other, their eyes wide with a shared emotion. The music had broken the awkward silence between them and replaced it with a new kind of understanding. They were seeing each other for the first time that night. The young woman at the piano sat frozen, her fingers still resting lightly on the keys. Her chest was rising and falling with each deep, shaky breath. She had her eyes closed for a long moment, still lost in the world of the music she had just created. When she finally opened them, she saw the room. She saw the faces. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. It was terrifying. The silence stretched on, becoming more and more profound with each passing second. It was a fragile thing, a beautiful crystal sculpture that could shatter at any moment. And then it did, from a table near the back. An older woman with silver hair pulled back in a gentle bun slowly put her hands together. Her clap was not loud. It was soft and deliberate and full of respect. It was a single, clear sound in the quiet room, like the first drop of rain in a dry desert. For a moment she was the only one clapping. Her eyes were fixed on the young waitress, and they were shining with tears. Then a man at the next table joined in. Then another. And another. The single clap became a gentle patter, like a soft rain turning into a shower. The sound grew, slowly at first, then faster and louder, until the entire room erupted. It was not the polite, half-hearted applause that the regular pianist sometimes received. This was a roar. It was a wave of sound, a thunderstorm of appreciation that crashed over the small stage and washed over the young woman. Making her flinch, people began to stand up. First one, then a whole table, then another, until the entire dining room was on its feet. Their hands were coming together, their faces turned towards her, their expressions a mixture of awe, gratitude, and pure joy. They were not just clapping for a performance. They were clapping for the feeling she had given them. They were clapping for the story she had told, a story that felt like their own. The young woman stared at the scene in front of her, her mind struggling to understand what was happening. This was her world, but it was completely upside down. These were the people she served, the people who never saw her, the people who lived in a different world from her own. And now they were on their feet, cheering for her. A hot blush crept up her neck and flooded her cheeks. She felt a desperate urge to run, to hide. To become the invisible waitress again, she gave a small, awkward nod towards the room, a gesture of thanks that felt clumsy and inadequate. Then she quickly stood up from the piano bench, almost stumbling in her haste to get away. She turned and practically fled the stage, her head down, as if she could block out the sound of the applause with her own two hands. But the sound followed her, a warm, powerful wave that pushed her forward. She walked quickly through the tables, but the path was different now. As she passed, people would reach out and gently touch her arm. A man she had served water to 100 times gave her a deep, respectful nod. The young couple on the date both smiled at her, a genuine, warm smile that reached their eyes. An old man grabbed her hand as she passed and held it for a second, his own eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for that." She didn't know what to say. She just nodded and kept walking, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt like a celebrity, a princess, a creature from another world. It was a wonderful, terrifying feeling. All she wanted to do was get back to the safety of the kitchen, to the familiar world of clattering pots and sharp orders. When she finally reached the swinging door that led to the staff area, she pushed through it and leaned against the cool metal, breathing heavily. The sounds of the restaurant, the roar of the applause, was muffled now, but she could still hear it. It was the sound of her life changing forever. Inside the kitchen, the other servers and cooks were staring at her. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, pride, and disbelief. They had always seen her as the quiet one, the girl who kept to herself. Now they were looking at her as if she was a stranger who had been secretly living among them. One of the other waitresses, a young woman who had always been friendly, but never close, came up and gave her a fierce hug. "That was amazing," she whispered into her ear. "I had no idea." The young woman just stood there, letting the hug happen, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she was watching a movie about someone else's life. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had just created that beautiful, powerful music. They didn't look any different. They still looked like the hands of a waitress. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that they were not the same. And neither was she. From the dining room, the applause was finally starting to die down. But she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The invisible girl had been seen. The silent voice had been heard. And the quiet world she had so carefully built around herself had just been shattered into a million pieces. The swinging door to the kitchen swung back and forth, slowly coming to a rest. The muffled roar of the dining room, the sound of her new reality, was on the other side. Here, in the hot, steamy world of clattering pans and sharp orders, everything was quiet. The cooks had stopped their work. The other servers, who usually spent this time rushing in and out, grabbing plates and shouting orders, were standing still. All eyes were on her. It was a different kind of being seen than the one in the dining room. This was the look of people who thought they knew you, but had just discovered you were a complete stranger. She leaned against the cool metal of a large refrigerator, trying to catch her breath. Her heart was still beating fast, a frantic drum solo in her chest. Her hands felt strange, tingly, as if they didn't belong to her. She looked down at them, turning them over and over. They were the same hands that had carried heavy trays of soup and scrubbed stubborn stains off plates. But now they were also the hands that had made a room full of powerful, important people cry and stand and cheer. It didn't seem possible, one of the younger cooks, a boy who was always covered in flour and had a quick smile, slowly walked over to her. He didn't say anything. He just held out a glass of water. She took it, her fingers brushing against his, and nodded a small thank you. The simple kindness of the gesture, the normalness of it, was like an anchor in the storm of her emotions. She took a long drink, the cool water a relief to her dry throat. Another server, a woman who had worked at the restaurant for years and who had always been a bit of a mother hen to the younger staff, came up and put a gentle arm around her shoulders. "Well, I'll be," she said, her voice soft and full of wonder. "All this time you had that in you." The young woman just shook her head, unable to speak. What could she say? That she had been hiding a whole world inside herself, afraid to let it out? Just then, the swinging door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. It was the manager, his face flushed, his hair a mess, and his eyes wide with an energy that was a mix of panic and pure excitement. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, but in a good way. His eyes scanned the kitchen, ignoring everyone else, and locked onto her. "You," he said, his voice a little shaky. He pointed a finger at her, then seemed to think better of it and let his hand drop. He walked towards her, the other staff parting to let him through. What was that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Out there." "What was that music?" The young woman just stared at him, her mind blank. She couldn't explain it. How could she put into words something that came from a place so deep inside her, a place she didn't even understand herself? I don't know," she finally managed to say. "It's just something I play." The manager shook his head as if trying to clear it. "Something you play?" he repeated, a slow smile spreading across his face. It was a genuine smile, not the polite, practiced one he usually wore for the customers. "That was not something you play? That was magic." He took a step closer, his expression turning serious, almost desperate. "I need that. This restaurant needs that. I want you to play here, every night, as our pianist." The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. The pianist, her, the quiet waitress. The idea was so big, so bright, it felt like looking directly at the sun. A new kind of fear, a fear of being seen, of having to live up to that moment, began to bubble up inside her. I can't," she stammered. "I'm not a real musician. I don't read music. I just, feel it." "And what about my job?" "I need my job." The manager laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "Your job? Your job is changing. You can't be a waitress anymore. Not after that. People will be coming here just to hear you play. We'll put your name on the marquee. We'll—" He stopped, seeing the look of sheer terror on her face. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down. He realized he was moving too fast, treating her like a business asset instead of a person who had just been through a life-altering experience. "Okay," he said, his voice softer now. "Okay, let's slow down. Forget the marquee. But I am serious about the offer. I want you to be the one who plays that piano." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the conflict in her eyes. He saw the girl who was comfortable in the shadows, who was now being asked to step into the spotlight. She thought about it. The thought of playing that beautiful piano every night, of letting her music fill the room, was a dream she had never allowed herself to have. It was a wonderful, terrifying thought. But the thought of giving up her other life, the simple, predictable life of a waitress, felt like a loss. She liked the quiet work. She liked being part of the background, the invisible force that made things run smoothly. It was safe. It was hers. "I'll do it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The manager's face lit up. "But," she added, holding up a hand, "I have a condition." "Anything," he said, without hesitation. "I still want to be a waitress," she said. 1 or 2 nights a week. I want to still be here, in this part of the restaurant." She couldn't explain it to him, not in a way he would understand, but she needed to hold on to that part of herself. She needed to remember where she came from, to keep her feet on the ground, even when her hands were on the keys and her head was in the clouds. The manager looked at her, a confused expression on his face. It was the strangest request he had ever heard. A girl with the talent to be a star, wanting to keep her job as a waitress. But then he nodded. "Okay," he said slowly. Okay, we can try that. You have a deal. He stuck out his hand and she shook it. It was a deal that would change both of their lives. The rest of the night passed in a strange, dreamlike blur. The diners slowly left, but as they passed her, they would stop and say kind things. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard, a woman whispered, squeezing her arm. You have a real gift, a man said, with a look of sincere respect. She accepted their words with a shy nod, still not quite believing they were talking to her. When the last customer had gone and the doors were locked, the staff began the long process of cleaning up. But the atmosphere was different. There was a buzz in the air, a shared excitement. They were no longer just a team of servers and cooks. They were the people who were there on the night. They were part of the story. Finally, the restaurant was empty and clean. The lights were dimmed, and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerators in the kitchen. The young waitress finished her final tasks, wiping down the last of the tables. She was alone. She walked slowly through the quiet dining room, her footsteps the only sound. And she found herself standing in front of the piano. It sat there, silent and beautiful, waiting for her. She ran her hand lightly over the smooth, polished wood. It was no longer just a dream, a faraway wish. It was hers. She sat down on the bench, the same place where her life had changed just a few hours ago. She didn't play a big, powerful song. She just played a few soft, quiet notes, a simple melody for herself. It was a sound of peace, of acceptance. The quiet waitress was still there. But now she was also a powerful pianist. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be.